Welcome to Conspiracy Deconstructed. Today, we're jumping straight into, well, one of the more fascinating digital mysteries that's been floating around the internet. It's this story about a really cryptic YouTube channel. People usually call it TID Channel or something similar. And what it does is it just posts these incredibly minimalist videos. We're talking simple colored slides, sometimes weird screen recordings, and these really unsettling audio tones.
Yeah, and our mission today is really to excavate this whole thing, intellectually, I mean. Is this channel, like the theories claim, a genuine dead man's switch? You know, for some deep cover intelligence agent, or maybe a secret government broadcast somehow leaking out. So we're going to dive deep into the sources you've provided. We'll be pitting the intentional craft of digital storytelling, the whole world of alternate reality games, against the hard, complex, verifiable reality of military radio physics, specifically high-frequency communication.
Okay, let's unpack this then, because the appeal isn't just that it's weird, right? It's the way it looks and sounds. It uses this aesthetic of secrecy. It feels functional somehow, repetitive, completely unpolished. And that kind of counterintuitively makes it feel more real, like it could be operational. It gives you this really unsettling feeling, like you're stumbling across something secret, something you definitely weren't supposed to see.
And what's truly fascinating here is how this whole narrative manages to bridge two different eras. You know, you've got the historical weight of Cold War paranoia, this idea that secrets are everywhere, things are being monitored constantly. And then you mash that up with the instant viral nature of modern digital folklore. It just spreads like wildfire online.
Yeah.
So we'll be contrasting that spooky lo-fi look with the honestly mind-numbing, quantifiable complexity of what a real signal in that kind of operational space actually has to deal with.
Right. Let's start with the core theory itself. Just lay it out there, no skepticism for now. For the people who believe this is real, what exactly is the TID channel supposed to be broadcasting, and why?
Well, proponents argue it's basically a 21st century digital version of a number station. The core visual evidence, as you said, it's incredibly minimalist. Just simple block-colored slides, white, black, maybe basic sequences of red, green, blue, and often, weirdly, accompanied by screen recordings of the channel itself, which creates a strange kind of self-referential, almost recursive lump.
And the sound, that seems to be the real trigger for the conspiracy theorists, right? It's not human speech.
Exactly. It's these cryptic, automated tones.
Yeah.
Sometimes just white static, or maybe synthesized voices or sounds. And it's all clearly intended to mimic those legendary, very real number stations that intelligence agencies actually used during the Cold War and beyond.
Okay, so the strength of the theory then, it rests on this perception of operational necessity. Like, it looks functional.
Precisely. The argument goes, if the messages seem regular, if they're repetitive, and if they lack any obvious entertainment value or context, well, the default assumption for enthusiasts is that they must be coded messages. They must be used by some intelligence agency. Why else would anyone bother uploading such, frankly, mundane and unsettling content so often?
And that loops right back to the ultimate hook, the really compelling part of the story, the dead man's switch.
Exactly. That's the narrative linchpin. The idea is that the channel's constant monotonous broadcast isn't the message itself, necessarily, but proof of life, or maybe proof that the system is still viable. So if the channel suddenly stops broadcasting, goes silent, that triggers some kind of emergency protocol, or it signals that an agent has been compromised, or worse. This concept immediately gives the whole thing enormous narrative weight, a terrifying sense of real-world urgency. It taps right into that primal human desire, to solve a puzzle that seems vitally important but is also explicitly designed to be opaque, inaccessible. That functional appearance implies some massive secret operational entity must be behind it all.
It really is the perfect storm, isn't it? Digitally accessible, anyone can find it on YouTube, but operationally obscure. You can see it, but you can't understand it.
Okay, now let's trace this back. Where did this whole idea even come from?
Right. To really understand why a theory about a secret digital spy signal could take root like this, we have to look at two main threads. They're the fertile ground, if you will. There's the analog reality as historical espionage, and then there's the digital context of participatory fiction, which is where ARGs come in.
And we absolutely have to start with that analog foundation, the number stations.
Yeah.
Because those weren't fiction. They were very real. Oh, absolutely real. These stations used high frequency, or HF, radio waves. We're talking typically in the 2 to 30 megahertz band. And the method was simple, but actually quite brilliant for clandestine communication back then. They broadcast these simple, repetitive messages, often just sequences of numbers, maybe 5-figure groups, read out by these synthesized, deliberately non-identifiable voices. And these were intended for agents operating deep in hostile territory, or just places where normal communication was impossible or too risky. The physics behind it involves the ionosphere, those electrically charged layers way up in the atmosphere, 30 to maybe 300 kilometers up.
Yeah.
It acts like a gigantic mirror, basically, reflects the HF signal back down to Earth. And that allowed communication way beyond the normal line of sight, perfect for covering huge, remote operational areas without needing satellites or complex infrastructure.
Okay, and this is where we bridge from that history lesson to the crucial technical bit that's supposedly embedded right in the channel's name. TID. You're saying that's not just a random spooky acronym, it actually relates to the physics of how those signals travel.
You've absolutely nailed the key piece of, verisimilitude here. The name itself sounds plausible. See, the HF band is notoriously susceptible to really complex environmental effects, things like solar flares, geomagnetic storms, and crucially for this, traveling ionospheric disturbances or tides. A tide is essentially a wave like an acoustic gravity waves propagating through the ionosphere. It causes ripples, density fluctuations, and these dramatically affect how the radio signal propagates. They cause fading, frequency shifting, all sorts of problems for reliable communication. And the technical research source we looked at, the one detailing HF and BIS channel analysis for military use, it specifically uses the term non-TED region when it's talking about building robust channel models. So that confirms right there that the term TIDE is already deeply embedded in the highly specialized jargon of military and government HF communications.
Wow, okay. So whether the person who created the YouTube channel actually knew that specific technical detail or just stumbled onto a technical sounding acronym that felt right, the result is the same. It gives this supposed secret channel a plausible, official-sounding name. It borrows a bit of technical legitimacy from a real complex phenomenon.
Exactly. It instantly adds this layer of historical and scientific gravity to what might otherwise just be seen as, weird digital art. Now, let's flip to the other side, the digital context. The rise of alternate reality games, or ARGs. The TID channel theory really emerged from internet culture, which is just incredibly fertile ground for these kinds of narrative experiences. Experiences that deliberately, intentionally blur the line between what's fiction and what's reality. That's verisimilitude.
And in ARG, it's not like watching a movie, right?
Yeah.
It's interactive. It needs the audience to participate. It often spreads across multiple platforms, videos, websites, maybe even real-world clues. That's the transmedia storytelling aspect. And critically, the story itself can often be shaped by what the players do, how they react.
Spot on. And the earliest, most influential examples really set the stage by using that low-fidelity, ambiguous content to suck people in. Take Ong's Hat. That started way back in the early 1990s. It was sort of a proto-ARG. It was based around these supposed paranormal experiments, interdimensional travel, that kind of thing. It even incorporated something called legend tripping, encouraging players to visit real-world locations mentioned in the story. And it was pretty successful. It fooled a decent chunk of the early internet population into thinking the story was actually genuine folklore or some hidden history they'd uncovered.
So it proved really early on that digital fiction, if presented in a certain raw, almost investigative way, could successfully pass itself off as a genuine mystery.
Mm-hmm. And then came the really big ones, the more commercial successes, and showed the collaborative power. The prime example is The Beast. That launched in 2001 as a promotional tool for the Spielberg movie AI, Artificial Intelligence. And it was this incredibly elaborate, sprawling murder mystery. It played out across hundreds of fake websites, emails, hidden codes in images, even voicemail messages, you could call it. It was a massive hit. And the participants, they organized themselves into this huge, dedicated online community. They call themselves the Cloud Makers.
And that collaborative effort is so important, isn't it? They weren't just passively consuming something. They were actively solving it together. They felt like investigators.
Exactly. And that massive collaboration actually forced the creators, the people behind the scenes, the puppet masters they had, to constantly invent new subplots, new puzzles, alter the game in real time just to stay ahead of this huge, clever player base. So the crucial aha moment for you, the listener, is this. ARGs intentionally use these unsettling, ambiguous formats precisely because it maximizes immersion. Think about it. If a fictional story looks too slick, too professional, too polished, it breaks that illusion of reality. So eerie or horror-themed narratives, the ones that use low-fidelity assets like the simple colored slides and tones of the TID channel, they're particularly successful. Because that ambiguity feeds the mystery. It makes the players feel like they are genuinely discovering hidden truths, piecing together clues.
Okay, before we bring in the heavy artillery, the technical sources, the physics, it's really important we treat the arguments from the proponents fairly, the people who do think the TI channel is real. We need to understand the arguments they make, both structurally and aesthetically, that give this conspiracy theory its staying power. We need to present their case charitably.
Absolutely, it's crucial. Because believers aren't just seeing random noise or simple colors. They're interpreting the channel through a very specific framework. A framework of what they expect covert operational requirements to look like. So first up, proponents argue that the really simple raw nature of the YouTube footage, those solid colored slides, the single tones, isn't a sign of, poor artistic effort or lack of resources. Instead, they see it as evidence of authenticity.
The argument being, why would a real secret intelligence agency waste time and money on fancy graphics or complex production? Wouldn't that just draw unnecessary attention?
Precisely that. They argue the content looks like it's designed purely for function, easily encoded, quickly disseminated. And that aligns with the necessary traits for secure communications, especially where bandwidth might be severely limited, and efficiency is absolutely paramount. We know from our sources that standard military narrowband, high-frequency systems are indeed highly bandwidth limited. They often operate over a really narrow 3 kilohertz bandwidth, just 3 kilohertz. So in that context, sending minimalist visual data or simple audio tones, well, it makes a certain kind of practical sense, doesn't it?
Right. And the conclusion they draw from that is quite powerful. This simplicity isn't just boring. It's interpreted as operational security. It's deliberately designed to be meaningless, maybe even boring, to anyone who doesn't have the specific key or knowledge to decode it. It avoids any kind of commercial polish, which, they argue, is usually the mark of something fake, something fictional.
Okay. The second point hinges on a psychological reality. It relies on the fact that successful ARGs have, historically, been mistaken for reality. It proves that creating convincing deception online is genuinely possible. The underlying game design principle here is pretty simple. The mystery works best when the audience starts to believe they've genuinely stumbled onto something illicit, something unscripted, something real.
And the history of the internet is just littered with examples of exactly that, isn't it? Digital stories that somehow cross that threshold into perceived reality.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the Junko Tensui ARG. That started back in 2009. It used incredibly dark, really immersive storytelling techniques. It began with just a Facebook account sending out mass friend requests. But when people investigated, they found hours and hours of really disturbing footage that seemed to show the account owner's sister being held captive. The whole plot was so dark, and the execution was so granular, using platforms people use every single day, like Facebook, that initially a lot of people were genuinely fooled. They actually contacted law enforcement, believing they were witnessing a real kidnapping unfold online.
Wow. And there was also that other really unnerving one, the meat sleep videos. Started around 2014.
Yes, Meat Sleep, another great example. This series of cryptic videos uploaded to YouTube. They had these bizarre, often non-English titles. And they featured these loose, unsettling narratives about fictional victims, often with this very disturbing found footage feel. Many people initially believed it was the genuine output of a disturbed individual, maybe even a criminal documenting something horrific. So believers in the TD channel theory, they cite examples like Junko Jinsui and Meat Sleep as proof that the appearance of authentic, low-fidelity, disturbing content is enough. It's sufficient to create the strong impression of a genuine leak or real criminal activity. And crucially, the ARG format itself really helps this deception along. There are usually no clear rules stated up front. The players, the audience, they have to discover the rules, figure out how the narrative works through trial and error. And that makes them feel less like players and more like actual detectives solving a real-world crime or deciphering a genuine code. That sense of actively investigating, rather than just passively watching, is a massive, massive draw. #3, the dead man switch technical angle.
Okay, and finally, there's a more sophisticated technical argument some believers make. They don't just rely on the spooky aesthetic. They argue that the sheer frequency of the uploads and the minimal nature of the content itself actually aligns with the genuine technical challenges you face with long-distance communication using high-frequency radio.
Right. They recognize that HF links are a proven method, although a complicated one, for communication. It's an alternative to satellite communications, SATCOM, and it's particularly useful for mobile units or for long-haul links or maybe covert operations where you can't rely on potentially fragile or easily monitored SATCOM infrastructure.
So what do they argue those constant low-level broadcasts are actually doing then from a technical perspective?
They see it as a necessary technical heartbeat, essentially. That constant signal, however simple it looks, serves two vital purposes in their view. First, it confirms system viability, just showing the link is up and running. And second, more technically, it's seen as constantly probing or conditioning the channel, helping the receiver track and adapt to the complex natural phenomena that govern real radio links. Things like those ionospheric variations we mentioned, multipath fading, and even the specific dynamics of the O and X modes we're about to get into. The idea is that a constant signal, even a simple one, is necessary for a receiver to maintain lock, to track and synchronize with the constantly shifting state of the radio channel. So they interpret this repetition, which seems incredibly boring to a casual observer. They interpret it as a vital operational confirmation signal. Proof that the spy mechanism, whatever it is still functioning correctly.
All right, now we get to the core of our analysis today. This is where we shift gears completely. We're moving away from the realm of digital folklore, ARG theory, and narrative expectation, and diving headfirst into the verifiable, often dense reality of military radio physics. We'll be drawing heavily now from those DTIC sources, the research on high-frequency near-vertical incidence skywave, or HF-NVIS channel analysis. The goal here is to systematically dismantle the conspiracy theory. We need to contrast the intentional artistic simplicity we see in the ARG-like TID channel with the frankly mind-boggling, quantifiable complexity of how real-world secure communication systems actually have to operate.
Okay, let's first just nail down our understanding of the artifice involved. The deliberate craft behind something like the TID channel, hashtag A, the intentional artifice of the ARG.
Right. The TID channel isn't some accident of technology or a clumsy leak. If it's an ARG or inspired by ARGs, it's a meticulously crafted piece of interactive digital art. An experienced ARG creator knows that simplicity, that ambiguity, actually enhances the mystery. It doesn't detract from it.
Yeah, the sources we looked at show that many of the most successful video-based ARGs, things like Petscop, which was based on this idea of a lost, creepy PlayStation game, or This House Has People in It, which used fake security camera footage. They intentionally used low-fidelity, eerie themes precisely to maximize audience engagement. It's a deliberate genre choice, sometimes called creepypasta verisimilitude, making creepy internet stories feel real.
Exactly. And the goal of the puppet master, the creator, is often to relinquish clear authorship, to create ambiguity, to make the audience work for the meaning. So the unsettling simplicity of the TID channel, the static, the bare colors, the complete lack of any human connection that's almost certainly a design choice, it's specifically engineered to trigger our pattern recognition instincts, to encourage the audience to piece together clues that might not actually exist or might be purely narrative constructs. The artistic simplicity is designed to imitate the idea of operational simplicity. But, and this is the crucial part, it absolutely does not represent the technical reality of the communication method it claims to be using.
Which brings us squarely to the unforgiving reality of that actual technology.
Okay. Real wideband HF-NVIS communication, the kind studied extensively by organizations like the U.S. Navy's Air Systems Center Pacific, it is profoundly complex. It involves physics that needs to be actively understood, measured, and defeated in real time by sophisticated electronics. It is absolutely not possible to just, to upload a simple audio or video file and expect it to work reliably as a long-range or secure broadcast using HF Skywave.
Let's start right at the ground level then, the antenna. The research you mentioned points out that the single biggest bottleneck, especially for mobile HF-NVIS links, is just the sheer physical size of the antenna you can realistically put on a vehicle. Why is that such a huge problem? Hashtag tag antenna bottleneck and noise rejection.
Well, it boils down to physics, specifically wavelength. The high frequency range, remember, is 2 to 30 megahertz. That corresponds to radio wavelengths between 10 meters and 100 meters long. That's huge. Now, for an antenna to radiate energy efficiently, it generally needs to be a significant fraction of that wavelength, often something like a quarter wave or a half wave long. Obviously, you cannot mount a 50-meter-long dipole antenna on the roof of a Humvee or a Jeep. It's physically impossible. So they have to use what are called electrically short antennas. And the problem is, short antennas are notoriously inefficient radiators, especially when you're trying to launch the energy almost straight up vertically into the ionosphere, which is what NVIS requires for short-range skywave.
Right, NVIS, near vertical incident skywave. That's for shorter hops, bouncing the signal almost straight up and straight back down, maybe up to 400 kilometers or so. So you need specialized antennas pointing upwards, like those low-profile loop antennas or horizontal dipoles mounted close to the vehicle.
Exactly. And the primary reason for using these specialized, often large loop antennas isn't just radiation pattern, it's noise rejection. Think about the environment these systems have to operate in. It's saturated with electromagnetic noise, not just natural atmospheric static, but incredibly high levels of urban man-made noise. We're talking interference from high-voltage power lines, industrial machinery, computers, digital electronics, everything. So for any kind of covert or reliable system to maintain a usable signal-to-noise ratio, SNR, it absolutely has to actively reject all this background interference.
And how significant is that noise rejection requirement? Did the research quantify it?
Oh, it's massive. The technical analysis shows that a sophisticated, properly designed loop antenna, like the ones they tested, can reduce that external radio frequency, RF noise, by as much as 20 decibels compared to a standard, simple, vertical whip antenna often seen on vehicles. They measured the noise floor picked up by the specialized loop to be roughly 25 dBs lower than the noise floor from a whip antenna under the same conditions. Now, 20 dB reduction, that's huge. That means 100 times less noise power is getting into the receiver. Without this kind of specialized, often physically large, noise-rejecting hardware, any supposed weak, covert signal would be completely swamped, drowned out by the urban RF background noise before the receiver even gets a chance to process it.
Okay, wow. So just to even hear a potentially faint signal, you need serious specialized antenna engineering. It's not just sticking a wire in the air. But even if they had the perfect antenna system, the signal still has that brutal journey through the ionosphere to survive, right? Hashtag multipath channel complexity of why simple tones won't work.
And this is really where the simple aesthetic of the TID channel just completely falls apart when compared to the physical reality. The actual operational HF channel isn't a single clean path from transmitter to receiver. Not even close. It's a vast, dynamic, constantly changing web of multiple signal paths or ray paths. The signal reflects off different layers in the ionosphere, primarily the E, F1, and F2 layers, which are at different altitudes, roughly between 100 kilometers and 300 kilometers up. So the signal can take multiple bounces to get to the receiver.
Great. The research mentioned things like 1-hop, 2-hop, sometimes even 3-hop paths, and they all arrive at the receiver almost simultaneously, but not quite.
Exactly. Each of those paths travels a slightly different distance. So each path introduces its own unique time delay, its own amount of signal attenuation or weakening, its own fading characteristics, and potentially even its own frequency shifts due to movement. Even a basic 1-hop signal, the most direct reflection, involves a significant time delay. The data shows around 1.6 to 1.7 milliseconds for typical NVIS paths. Now, if you're using wideband HF systems, which the military does specifically to maximize data throughput, these multiple arrivals, separated by milliseconds or fractions of milliseconds, lead directly to a huge problem called inter-symbol interference, or ISI. Basically, the trailing energy from one transmitted symbol, like a bit or a piece of data, spills over in time and corrupts the next symbol arriving via a slightly different path. It smears the data out.
Okay, so if a real system tried to use just a simple continuous audio tone, like we see implied on the TI channel, what would happen when those multiple copies arrive just milliseconds apart, like that 0.12 millisecond separation mentioned between the O and X modes?
It would mean absolute signal corruption, total chaos at the receiver. Imagine throwing, say, 5 rocks into a perfectly still pond all at once from slightly different spots. Do you expect 5 perfectly distinct sets of ripples to arrive at your boat one after the other cleanly? No way. They overlap, they interfere, they merge, they cancel each other out in complex ways. It's the same for a radio signal. For a digital data stream, those slight time separations measured in milliseconds are catastrophic if you're just sending a simple waveform. This is precisely why real high-speed HF data systems don't use simple tones. They use much wider bandwidths, typically 25 kilohertz bandwidth according to the source material. And they use that wider bandwidth not just to transmit more data per second, but to allow for sophisticated signal processing techniques, things like orthogonal frequency division, multiplexing, OFBM, or spread spectrum techniques. These techniques can actually resolve those multiple arrivals and cleverly turn the problem multipath interference into an advantage by combining the energy from different paths constructively. It's called achieving diversity gain. Simple, non-synchronized continuous audio tones cannot possibly do this. They lack the structure needed for the receiver to tell the different paths apart. Hashtag O mode and X mode physics and polarization.
Okay, this sounds like the most complex part, but maybe the most definitive argument against the YouTube channel's technical authenticity. We have to talk about the ordinary mode, O mode, and the extraordinary mode, X mode. Can you explain what exactly happens when an HF radio wave hits the charged particles, the plasma of the ionosphere, especially considering the Earth's magnetic field is present?
Right. The physics term for this is birefringence. It's similar to how some crystals can split a beam of light. Because the ionosphere is a plasma, charged particles, and it exists within the Earth's magnetic field, the medium itself becomes anisotropic, meaning its properties depend on direction. This causes the ionosphere to act like a kind of polarizing filter or prism for the radio wave. It splits the incoming radio signal into two distinct separate modes of propagation, the O mode and the X mode. You can almost think of it like a highway where the Earth's magnetic field acts like traffic police, forcing the signal energy into two separate lanes. And crucially, these two lanes have slightly different properties, like different speed limits or slightly different routes.
And they don't just travel along parallel paths, do they? The research indicated they actually split apart, both spatially and in time.
That's correct. The O mode and the X mode are affected differently by the magnetic field interacting with the plasma. They often follow slightly different physical paths through the ionosphere, sometimes separated by quite large distances horizontally, and they typically travel at slightly different effective altitudes or speeds. The result is that they arrive back at the receiver on the ground slightly separated in time. The measurement data we looked at showed the O mode arriving around 1.71 milliseconds after transmission, and the X mode arriving slightly later, around 1.83 milliseconds. That's a time separation of about 0.12 milliseconds in that specific measurement.
Okay, but the really crucial part seems to be their polarization, right? Why does that make a simple antenna like a basic whip totally inadequate?
Absolutely crucial. Polarization is key. These two modes, the O and the X, don't just arrive at different times. They arrive with specific and often time-varying polarizations. Generally speaking, near the receiver, the O mode is typically left elliptically polarized, LEP, and the X mode is right elliptically polarized, REP. Now, here's the problem. These two polarizations are orthogonal, or very nearly orthogonal to each other, like vertical and horizontal polarization, but for elliptical waves. So when these two signals with their near orthogonal polarizations arrive at a single, simple receiver antenna, like a vertical whip, which only responds well to vertically polarized signals, they interfere with each other in a very destructive way. This causes massive, rapid, unpredictable fluctuations in the received signal strength. It's a specific type of fading known as Faraday fading, named after the Faraday rotation effect.
Faraday fading. So that's basically destructive interference caused by these two differently polarized modes arriving together and canceling each other out at the antenna, making the signal just disappear for moments.
Precisely. If you were trying to receive this signal using only one simple antenna, which is sort of the implied simplicity of the TID channel setup, you would suffer catastrophic, unpredictable signal dropouts, potentially every few seconds, just due to the natural movement and changes in the ionosphere affecting the relative phase of the O and X modes. This physical reality absolutely necessitates the use of much more sophisticated receiver architectures in real systems. Things like single input, multiple output, SIMO, where you have one transmit antenna but multiple receive antennas spaced apart, or even multiple input, multiple output, MIMO systems. The key is using multiple antennas. These antennas might be separated spatially to catch the signal in slightly different locations where the fading might be different. Or critically, they might be designed to respond to different polarizations. For example, using both a vertically polarized antenna and a horizontally polarized antenna, or antennas designed for right-hand and left-hand circular polarization. This ensures that even if one mode, say the O mode hitting the vertical antenna, is fading out due to Faraday rotation, the other mode, the X mode hitting the horizontal antenna, is likely being received strongly. This is called achieving polarization diversity.
Wait, you also mentioned the polarization actually changes along the path. That sounds incredibly complicated for a receiver to deal with. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, it is incredibly complicated and adds another layer of complexity that simple systems just can't handle. The polarization isn't static throughout the journey. The DPIC analysis actually models this. It shows that for a typical one-hop NBIS signal path, the O-mode polarization might start its journey upwards from the transmitter being, say, left circularly polarized, LCP. Then as it travels through the magnetized plasma and reflects, its polarization state rotates. It might pass through being linearly polarized, say, vertical, at some point in the path. And by the time it arrives back at the ground receiver, it might have rotated all the way to being essentially right circularly polarized RCP. The X mode does the opposite. It might start as RCP near the transmitter, pass through being horizontally polarized mid-path, and end up being LCP at the receiver. So a real, operational, modern HF receiver must employ sophisticated digital processing algorithms. These algorithms have to dynamically track and adapt to these complex, constantly shifting polarization states in real time. They need to do this to properly combine the energy from both modes and achieve the necessary diversity gain to combat that Faraday fading and maintain a reliable link. Honestly, understanding this level of physics just makes the idea of a simple,
continuous raw audio tone being sufficient for any kind of robust or secure communication over HF, well, it makes it completely laughable from a serious engineering perspective. Hashtag Doppler shift and synchronization, GPSDO. And one last piece of physics we can't ignore, the movement factor. The channel isn't static, it's non-stationary, because the vehicles carrying the receivers might be moving, perhaps at high speed, and the ionosphere itself is not stationary, it drifts and changes constantly.
Ah, so that introduces Doppler shift, a change in the received frequency of the signal because of the relative movement between the transmitter and receiver and movement of the reflective layers.
Correct. The measurements documented in the source material show that a vehicle traveling at typical highway speeds, say 60 to 80 miles per hour, can introduce Doppler shifts of up to 0.7 hertz on the received HF signal. That shift, combined with potentially slower drifts caused by ionospheric movement, means the signal is constantly being smeared out slightly in the frequency domain.
Okay, so for a genuine high-speed data transmission, dealing with all this, the multipath delays, the polarization rotation, the Doppler shifts, it must require incredibly precise synchronization between the transmitter and receiver, right? You mentioned GPS-disciplined oscillators, GPSDOs before. Why are they so critical?
They are absolutely critical for modern wideband HF systems. A GPS-DO uses the ultra-precise timing signals broadcast by the GPS satellite constellation to lock or discipline the frequency of the internal clock oscillator within the radio transmitter and receiver. This allows their internal clocks to be synchronized within tiny fractions of a microsecond. And this hyper-precise synchronization is necessary because real systems don't just send simple tones, they use complex, digitally coded waveforms. Often, pseudorandom noise, PN sequences, are embedded in the signal. These PN sequences serve multiple purposes. They help encode the actual data, they can spread the signal energy over a wider bandwidth to make it more robust against interference, spread spectrum, and crucially, they allow the receiver to perform correlation processing. Correlation is how the receiver can distinguish between the different signal paths, the O mode, the X mode, the one-hop arrival, the two-hop arrival, that are all arriving just milliseconds apart. By correlating the received signal with a synchronized copy of the known PN sequence, the receiver can essentially see multiple distinct peaks corresponding to the different arrival times and paths. Without that microsecond level synchronization, usually provided by a GPSDO, the receiver simply cannot successfully run this correlation recovery process. It wouldn't know precisely when to expect the start of each symbol or sequence. It couldn't tell the closely spaced multipath components apart. A simple YouTube video, of course, requires absolutely zero synchronization of this nature. Hashtag C. Conclusion of deconstruction.
Okay, so let's bring it all together. When we look at the raw visual and auditory evidence presented by the TID channel, the colored slides, the simple tones, that minimalist, almost stark aesthetic, it really is a near-perfect mimicry of the concept of a Cold War number station. It perfectly captures that spooky, clandestine aesthetic. It plays entirely on that feeling.
Exactly, it nails the vibe. But based on the physics and engineering reality documented in our sources, it is completely, utterly disconnected from the actual engineering requirements of making such a system work using HF radio. A real government or military HF NVIS broadcast is governed by physics so incredibly complex. We're talking multiple time-varying polarized signal modes, O and X. We're talking noise rejection that requires physically large, specialized antennas just to pull the signal out of the background noise, potentially needing 20 dBs or more of noise reduction compared to simple antennas. We're talking about needing GPS-level synchronization and sophisticated digital signal processing, using things like PN sequences and correlation just to recover the data from those multiple time-separated fading signal arrivals across a necessarily wide bandwidth, like 25 kilohertz. The raw signal, before all that processing, would be completely unrecognizable noise to the uninitiated. So the simple YouTube slides and tones, they're almost certainly a work of digital art, a narrative device, designed specifically to generate mystery and leverage that Cold War aesthetic.
They are not in any way, shape, or form representative of operational reality in the HF spectrum. So, okay, the technical analysis strongly suggests the TID channel is likely an ARG, or at least a piece of digital art intentionally designed to look like a genuine leak or secret broadcast. And yet, the mystery persists. It remains sticky online. People are still fascinated by it, still debate it. So the final question we really need to tackle is why? Why is this idea, the idea of stumbling upon a secret broadcast, so persistent and appealing in our digital age?
It really does seem to tap into something fundamental about our psychology, doesn't it? Maybe our desire for control or for meaning. The idea that there's a hidden layer to reality, a powerful structure operating just beneath the surface of the everyday news cycle. Discovering that feels significant.
I think that's absolutely the core psychological draw.
Mm-hmm.
Our sources that look into ARG scholarship, they talk about how these games provide exigence for the players. That's EXIGENCE. It basically means they turn what could be just abstract puzzle solving into something that feels like urgent narrative action.
Yeah.
You're not just passively consuming media anymore. You feel like you are actively engaged in something important, something that matters, like decoding a potential dead man switch, maybe uncovering a conspiracy. This fulfills a really powerful psychological need, the need to feel essential, to be an active participant in an important event, not just a bystander.
And the reward isn't just intellectual, like solving the puzzle. It's social too, right? You feel like you've gained access to secret knowledge that most other people are completely oblivious to.
Mm-hmm. That feeling of empowerment, of being an investigator, rather than just a consumer, it fosters a really strong sense of community among participants. It echoes how those original cloud makers banded together to solve the beast ARG. The shared effort, the collaboration involved in deciphering minimal or ambiguous clues, it reinforces everyone's belief that the mystery itself must be real and significant. The social validation you get from the community, yes, I see that pattern too. It confirms the individual's feeling that maybe they are smarter or more aware or just more dedicated than the general public who dismisses it.
And you mentioned earlier how the ARG creator often kind of relinquishes clear authorship. They let the audience participate, maybe even shape the narrative through their actions or interpretations. That must blur the lines even further.
Definitely. It makes the truth of the narrative feel discovered through rigorous collaborative investigation, rather than feeling like it was just handed down by a scriptwriter or game designer. It feels more authentic because the community helped build it, in a way.
It makes sense. In a world that often feels chaotic, filled with abstract information overload, political uncertainty, complex global problems we can't easily solve.
Exactly. In that context, identifying a clear, powerful adversary, even if it's a fictional one, like a shadowy intelligence agency behind the TID channel, or discovering a clear, solvable, definable structure within the chaos, that can be profoundly psychologically satisfying. It provides a sense of order, a puzzle that can be solved, and crucially, the simulated complexity of the art, like a simple colored slide that implies vast hidden secrecy. That simulated complexity is infinitely easier for us to digest, engage with, and feel competent about than the genuine, dense, difficult, and often, frankly, inaccessible complexity of real-world scientific operations or intelligence work.
Which brings us right back to where we started, in a way. Back to the ionosphere, the O and X modes, the Faraday fading, the GPS steos.
Right. And this raises, I think, a really important closing question for us to consider. If the success of these kinds of compelling internet mysteries relies, at least partly, on the audience believing they could be real government leaks or secret operations, what happens to our collective critical thinking skills? What happens when the simulated complexity of fiction, like a spooky YouTube tone and a colored slide, becomes far more appealing, more engaging, more satisfying for us to grapple with than the genuine, dense, demanding complexity of actual science or government operations? Operations that involve things like understanding Doppler spreading, predicting ionospheric conditions, mastering the polarization dynamics of the ordinary and extraordinary modes, and engineering systems to overcome them in real time just to achieve secure communication.
That is a phenomenal point to end on. Are we, maybe as a digital society, becoming primed to mistake artistic mimicry for genuine operational secrecy simply because the physics, the engineering, the reality is just too hard, too messy, too demanding for us to easily digest or engage with? What stands out to you about this whole comparison? Did the deep dive into the technical reality, the Faraday fading, the polarization diversity, the noise rejection, did that surprise you? Or does the aesthetic appeal, the spooky simplicity of the conspiracy theory still hold some weight for you? We'd love to know what you think. Head over to our platform, let us know your stand, share your thoughts on this episode. We'll see you next time on Conspiracy Deconstructed.